Chapter 1. The Empty Pulpit. The village of Briarcombe took its Sunday morning seriously. Mist lingered over hedgerows, bells waited in their tower, and parishioners arrived with quiet regularity, as though each step towards St. Bartholomew's Church were part of an old ritual. Hats were removed, gloves were folded, children were hushed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stone and beeswax. Miss Elspeth Carraway sat poised at the organ, fingers resting lightly above the keys. She glanced toward the chancel steps. No vicar? At first no one spoke of it. Reverend Arthur Whitcombe was not a man known for lateness. He appeared faithfully each Sunday, offering mild sermons and gentle counsel, his presence as dependable as the collection plate. Mrs. Pritchard leaned toward her neighbour. "Perhaps he is indisposed." "Hush," came the reply. At the back of the nave, Margaret Blythe stood rigid, her gloved hands clasped tightly. As churchwarden, she oversaw everything, from hymn books to heating. Today, she oversaw an empty pulpit. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Miss Carraway cleared her throat. Margaret stepped forward. "Please remain seated," she said evenly. "The Reverend will join us shortly." The lie fell softly, but it fell. Inspector Harold Price observed all this from the side aisle. He had not come to Briarcombe for church. A routine administrative matter with the local magistrate had delayed his departure the previous evening. He had intended to leave after the service, but Price had learned long ago that when villages grew quiet, it was rarely without reason. The curate appeared suddenly from the side door, pale and breathless. "He isn't at the rectory," young Mr. Henshaw whispered urgently to Margaret. "His coat and hat are still inside." Margaret's jaw tightened. Inspector Price stepped forward. "Miss Blythe," he said quietly, "when was Reverend Whitcombe last seen?" "Last night," she replied, "after supper." "And this morning?" "He ought to have been here." Price nodded once. "Ought," he repeated. He turned to the curate. "Would you care to accompany me to the rectory?" Mr. Henshaw looked relieved to be given direction. The rectory stood just beyond the churchyard, ivy clinging to its walls. Inside, a breakfast tray sat untouched, cold tea, toast, and an egg gone glossy. The vicar's study told a different story. Papers were scattered across the desk. A drawer stood half open. An ink bottle lay on its side, black spreading slowly across the blotter. Price knelt and touched the edge of the stain. Still tacky, recent. Reverend Whitcombe had not left calmly. Mrs. Dallow, the housekeeper, wrung her apron. "He wouldn't go out without his coat," she whispered. Price straightened. Then he heard it. A faint creak, not footsteps. Rope. "The tower," Mr. Henshaw breathed. Price took his hat. "Then that is where we are going." The door at the base of the bell tower opened reluctantly. Inside, ropes hung in pale rows, and a ladder climbed into shadow. Price ascended first. Halfway up, the air changed. It carried a quiet metallic stillness, something he recognised from other scenes, other places. At the platform above, he found Reverend Arthur Whitcombe lying crumpled near the bell mechanism. Pinned to the front of his robes was a sheet of paper. Mr. Henshaw staggered back, one hand to his mouth. "Oh, God!" Price crouched beside the body. The vicar's skin was cold. A dark patch marked the back of his head. One blow. He read the note without touching it. "I confess I stole the restoration funds. God forgive me." Price noticed the ink first. It still shone faintly. He noticed the pin, new, bright against old fabric. He noticed the handwriting. He had seen the vicar's sermons. This was not his hand. Price rose slowly. "This is not suicide," he said quietly. Mr. Henshaw stared at him. "But the confession was staged." Price examined the platform. A heavy wrench lay slightly apart from the other tools. A scuffed mark crossed the boards near the ladder. A confrontation. A sudden strike. Below, voices echoed faintly as people gathered. Margaret Blythe's voice rose from the tower entrance. "Inspector Price?" "The Reverend has been found," Price called down. There was a pause. "Alive?" Price did not soften the truth. "No." He turned back to the body. already assembling the pattern in his mind. Someone had confronted Reverend Whitcombe, someone afraid of what he intended to say, and someone had decided that silence was safer than truth. Above them, the bells remained quiet, but Inspector Price knew they would not stay that way for long. Chapter 2. Death Above the Bells. The constable arrived within minutes, breathless and pale. Inspector Price instructed him to seal the tower and keep the villagers away. Briarcombe obeyed quietly, retreating indoors with the peculiar efficiency of people accustomed to privacy. Curtains fell. Doors closed. The churchyard emptied. Price remained inside the tower. Reverend Whitcombe's body had been carefully covered with a coat borrowed from the curate. Price climbed back to the platform alone, moving slowly, letting his eyes absorb every detail. The boards bore faint scuff marks near the ladder. Someone had stepped backward. Someone else had advanced. The heavy wrench lay a short distance away, not dropped in panic, but placed deliberately. A small chip marked where metal had struck stone. Price traced the imagined arc of the weapon and noted where Whitcombe must have stood, facing the bells, blocking his retreat. The confession note had already been photographed and removed, but Price carried a copy folded neatly in his pocket. He withdrew it now and studied the handwriting. The strokes were thick and deliberate. He thought of the vicar's sermon drafts on the rectory desk, restrained, economical, the writing of a man accustomed to careful thought. This was mimicry. He examined the ink marks reproduced in the photograph, still glossy when first discovered, which meant the note had been written after death. Price closed his notebook. The rope nearest the platform hung slightly apart from the others. He lifted it gently. Above, a bell shifted with a muted groan. So, the bell had been disturbed during the confrontation, perhaps by Whitcombe himself, instinctively reaching for help. Someone had ensured it remained silent afterward. Price descended. At the tower entrance, Margaret Blythe stood rigidly beside the constable, hands clasped, posture unbroken. Her eyes searched his face. "What have you learned?" she asked. "That Reverend Whitcombe did not take his own life," Price replied calmly, "and that the confession was forged." Margaret inhaled sharply. "That is a grave accusation." "It is an accurate one." She pressed her lips together. "You believe someone murdered him?" "Yes." Her gaze flickered. "And staged it to look like suicide?" "Yes." Margaret's voice dropped. "Who would do such a thing?" Price studied her carefully. "Someone who feared what the Reverend intended to reveal." Margaret hesitated. "He had been reviewing old parish records," she said. Price nodded. "So I was told." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "He mentioned nothing to me." Price did not contradict her. He simply thanked her and moved away. He conducted the next interviews in the rectory parlour. Edward Hale arrived first, irritation radiating from every polished button. "The man confessed," Hale said sharply. "What more is there to discuss?" "You donated heavily to the Restoration Fund 12 years ago," Price replied, "and lost it. You threatened legal action." "I withdrew it." "Why?" Hale hesitated. "For the good of the village." Price leaned back. "Or because you believed Whitcombe was protecting someone?" Hale's jaw tightened. "Yes," he admitted. "I never believed he acted alone." Clara Whitcombe came next. She spoke quietly, but with conviction. "My uncle told me last night he meant to correct a wrong that had stood too long." "In his sermon?" "Yes." Price noted that. "He said silence had become complicity." Thomas Reed entered last. The bell ringer's hands were scarred from years of rope work, his eyes swollen and red. "You were instructed not to ring the bells this morning," Price said. Thomas nodded. "By whom?" "Miss Blythe." "When?" "Just after dawn, outside the tower." "Did you speak to the Reverend yourself?" "No, sir, I did not." Price let the silence stretch. "Thomas," he said quietly, "if the Reverend intended to confess and die, why would he ask for silence?" Thomas stared at the floor. "I don't know." But his voice carried doubt. Price ended the interviews and returned briefly to the tower. The pieces now formed a clearer shape. 12 years earlier, funds had vanished. Whitcombe had accepted blame. Hale suspected protection. Clara confirmed a planned revelation. Margaret admitted the Reverend had revisited old records. Thomas obeyed instructions that ensured silence. And in the tower, a confrontation, a single fatal blow, a freshly written confession. Price wrote one word in his notebook: loyalty. Someone had been shielded long ago. Now that shield was cracking. As Price exited the churchyard, the evening light slanted across the tower stones, turning them briefly gold. Inspector Price adjusted his coat collar against the cooling air. He knew what came next. Someone would break. And when they did, the bells would finally be allowed to speak. Chapter 3. Old Sins in a Small Village. By afternoon, Briarcombe had retreated behind curtains. News moved quickly in villages, but emotion travelled more cautiously. Conversations were held in lowered voices, kettles were boiled and forgotten, and the churchyard stood empty. Inspector Price established himself in the rectory parlour. The room overlooked the tower, its narrow window framing grey stone and quiet sky. He arranged his notebook, fountain pen, and the vicar's recovered papers with precise economy. Then he asked for the 4 individuals most closely connected to Reverend Whitcombe. Margaret Blythe arrived first. She sat upright, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. "You managed parish finances for many years," Price said. 15, she replied. "The restoration funds disappeared 12 years ago." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." Reverend Whitcombe accepted responsibility. "He did. Was he guilty?" A pause. "He believed it best the matter end quietly." "That was not my question." Margaret's fingers pressed against the fabric of her skirt. "No," she said at last. "I do not believe he was." "Did he recently revisit the subject?" "No, he did not." Her answer came too quickly. Price let it pass. "He was reviewing documents," he said. Margaret looked away. "Many people revisit the past," she replied. "It does not mean they intend to disturb it." Price thanked her and showed her out. Edward Hale entered with visible irritation. "You're wasting time," Hale said. "The man confessed." "The handwriting does not match," Price replied calmly. Hale stopped. "You donated heavily to the restoration fund." "And lost it." "You suspected someone else benefited." "Yes." "Whom?" Hale hesitated. "I never proved it." "But you believed Whitcombe protected them." Hale nodded reluctantly. "He was too decent for his own good." "Did he ever speak of correcting the record?" "Not to me." Price noted that. Clara Whitcombe arrived quietly. She carried herself with restraint, but her eyes were sharp. "My uncle told me last night he intended to tell the truth," she said, without prompting. "In his sermon?" "Yes." "About the funds?" "Yes." Price leaned forward. "Did he name anyone?" "No, only that he was tired of lying for others." "Did he fear consequences?" Clara hesitated. "He said the village would not thank him." Price closed his notebook. "Thank you." Thomas Reed entered last. The bell ringer looked smaller indoors, his shoulders rounded, his hands twisting his cap. "You were told not to ring the bells this morning," Price said. "Yes." "By whom?" "Miss Blythe." "When?" "Just after dawn, outside the tower." "Did you go up?" "No, I did not." "Why?" "She said the Reverend asked for quiet." Price studied Thomas carefully. "And you obeyed?" "Yes." Price waited. Thomas swallowed. "Inspector, Reverend Whitcombe wouldn't have wanted silence." Price said nothing. He dismissed Thomas and remained alone. Outside, the tower cast a long shadow across the churchyard. Price began assembling the sequence. 12 years earlier, parish funds vanished. Whitcombe absorbed blame. Hale suspected protection. Margaret controlled the books. Clara confirmed Whitcombe intended to confess publicly. Thomas prevented the bells from sounding. And in the tower, fresh ink, a staged confession, a fatal blow. Price opened Whitcombe's sermon draft. Near the bottom, a line had been added in smaller script. "Today I intend to correct a wrong that has stood for 12 years. Price stared at it. That sentence had signed Whitcombe's death warrant. He wrote a single word in his notebook. Exposure. Someone had lived safely beneath Whitcombe's silence. Now that silence was ending. Price leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. The killer had not planned a murder. They had planned to stop a confession. Everything after, the note, the staging, Thomas's involvement, had been desperation, which narrowed the field considerably. People who kill to preserve reputation rarely think beyond the next hour. They rely on loyalty. They rely on shock. They rely on others to help tidy the mess. Price stood and crossed to the window. Briarcombe looked peaceful again. Smoke drifted from chimneys. A cat crossed the lane. Villages excelled at appearing unchanged. But Price knew better. Somewhere nearby, someone was carrying 12 years of guilt and one fresh, irreversible crime. And when confronted with that weight, they would not hold forever. Inspector Price returned to his chair. Soon someone would speak. Inspector Price returned to the bell tower at dusk. The constable remained stationed below. The churchyard had emptied again, though curtains still shifted faintly in nearby cottages. The village was watching, even if it pretended not to be. Price climbed alone. He reached the platform and paused, letting his eyes retrace the morning's discoveries. The scuffed boards, the wrench, the faint mark where metal had struck stone, and the rope, slightly separated from the others. Price moved toward it and pulled gently. Above, the bell shifted with a low groan. He released it. During the confrontation, Whitcombe had likely reached for it, instinctively, desperately, a reflex, a final attempt to summon help. But no one had answered. Price crouched where the body had lain. He reconstructed the positions carefully. Whitcombe facing the bells. Another figure between him and the ladder. Words exchanged, not a struggle, an argument. The blow delivered from close range, quick, frightened, not premeditated. Price straightened. The confession note had been theatrical. Bold lettering, emphatic phrasing, finality. It had not been written by a man contemplating death. It had been written by someone attempting to control interpretation. He removed a folded sheet from his pocket, a sermon draft recovered from the rectory. He read it again. There comes a time when silence becomes complicity. There comes a time when truth must be spoken, regardless of consequence. Today I intend to correct a wrong that has stood for 12 years. Price folded the paper slowly. Whitcombe had not intended to die. He had intended to speak, and someone had ensured he never would. Footsteps sounded below. Price descended. Margaret Blythe stood just inside the tower entrance. She had removed her gloves. Her hands were pale. "You continue to examine," she said. "Yes." Her gaze drifted upward. "Have you determined who did it?" "Yes," Price replied calmly. She stilled. "You believe you know?" "I do." A silence settled between them. "You accused the note of being forged," she said. "It was. How can you be certain?" The ink was fresh. The handwriting imitated Whitcombe's, but lacked his natural stroke. And the phrasing was blunt, constructed for display. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly. He believed loyalty was a virtue, until it endangered truth. Margaret's composure wavered, just barely. Price stepped closer. "He confronted you in this tower." Her breathing changed, shallow, controlled. "He told you he intended to confess publicly." "No," she said too quickly. "He told Clara." Margaret's face lost a degree of colour. "He reviewed old records. He revisited the accounts. He realised silence had become complicity." Margaret's voice sharpened. "You assume too much." "I reconstruct," Price corrected evenly. He continued. 12 years ago, parish funds disappeared. The books were altered. Whitcombe absorbed the blame. Margaret's eyes fixed on his. "He did so willingly." "Yes," Price said, "because you asked him to." The word hung between them. Margaret did not move. "You needed the money," Price continued. "Your sister required treatment. You intended to repay it quietly." Her lips parted slightly. "He discovered the discrepancy. He chose to shield you." "Yes." Her voice had softened, almost pleading. "He was kind. And when he decided to correct the record," Price said quietly, "you panicked." Margaret's composure cracked. "He would have ruined everything," she burst out. "The village would have despised me. they would have torn down every good thing I built. He believed truth mattered more than reputation. He was wrong, she snapped. Silence followed. Price did not raise his voice. You argued here. He stood by the bells. You stood between him and the ladder. Margaret's breathing became uneven. He said he could not lie any longer, she whispered. You told him to remain silent. Yes. And when he refused? She closed her eyes. I only meant to stop him. The wrench was within reach, Price said. Her hands trembled visibly now. He stepped toward me, she said. I pulled away. You swung. Her voice broke. Yes. The admission echoed against stone. Price spoke gently. The blow killed him instantly. Margaret covered her face. I didn't mean... Intent does not change the outcome. She lowered her hands slowly. He looked surprised, she whispered. Not angry, just disappointed. Price let that sit. And afterward? He asked. I didn't know what to do. You fetched Thomas? Yes. You told him it was an accident? Yes. You dictated the confession? Margaret nodded weakly. I thought, if people believed he had confessed, they would stop asking questions. You misjudged him, Price said quietly. She looked up. How? He would never have written that note, and you underestimated how carefully I would read it. Margaret's shoulders slumped. He protected me once, she murmured. I thought I could protect myself. Price regarded her steadily. Protection built on deception collapses eventually. She did not resist when the constable entered. As she was led away, her eyes lifted briefly toward the bells above. For 12 years, silence had preserved her. In a single moment, fear had destroyed everything. Inspector Price stepped out of the tower into the cool evening air. Thomas Reed did not attempt to flee. Inspector Price found him seated in the small maintenance shed behind the church, elbows resting on his knees, cap twisted tightly in his hands. The door stood open, letting in the fading light of early evening. A coil of rope lay forgotten at his feet. Price entered quietly and closed the door. Thomas looked up, eyes swollen and red. I didn't kill him, he said immediately. Price nodded. I know. Thomas sagged with relief, then stiffened again. But I helped. Yes, Price replied. You did. Price gestured to the bench along the wall. Sit properly. Thomas obeyed. Price remained standing. You were in the tower after Reverend Whitcombe died? Thomas swallowed. Yes. Tell me. It came slowly. He had arrived just after dawn, as he always did, to check the ropes. The tower door had already been unlocked. When he climbed the ladder, he found the vicar lying near the bells. At first I thought he'd fallen, Thomas whispered. I called his name. I shook him. Price said nothing. He was cold. Thomas wiped his face with his sleeve. Margaret came up behind me. Price nodded. She told you it had been an accident. Yes. She said he'd frightened her, that he'd said he would ruin everything. Thomas nodded again. She was crying. I've never seen her cry. Price folded his hands behind his back. She told you the village would turn on her. Yes. And you believed her? She raised me, Thomas said quietly. After my parents died, she took care of me and sent me to school. She made sure I had work. Price let the silence stretch. Loyalty can make good men do very bad things, he said. Thomas stared at the floor. She saw the sermon papers in his pocket, Thomas continued. She knew he meant to tell everyone. Price closed his eyes briefly. She told me Reverend Whitcombe had already confessed once years ago. She said people would believe it again. And you agreed to help. Thomas nodded. She dictated the words. I copied them from old parish documents. I pinned the paper to his robe. And the bells? She told me to keep them silent, said it would make it look deliberate. Price exhaled slowly. You knew it wasn't right. Yes, but you obeyed. Yes. Price stepped closer. Thomas, did Margaret strike him intentionally? Thomas hesitated. She said he stepped toward her. She pulled away. And the wrench was in her hand. Thomas nodded. She didn't mean to kill him. Price's voice was steady. She meant to stop him. The result was the same. Thomas's shoulders shook. I thought I was helping her survive the day, he whispered. I didn't think beyond that. That is often how these things begin, Price said quietly. He opened the shed door. Constable Harris stood waiting. "Take Mr. Reed into custody," Price said, aiding after the fact. Thomas did not resist. As he was led away, he turned back once. "She loved this village," he said desperately. Price met his gaze. "So did Reverend Whitcombe?" Margaret Blythe sat alone in the rectory drawing room. The fire burned low, shadows gathered along the walls. Price entered without ceremony. She looked up. "You spoke to Thomas?" "Yes." Her eyes closed. "So it is finished?" "It is." She folded her hands in her lap. "I gave everything to this place," she said quietly. "I kept it running. I made sure no one went hungry. I arranged every charity drive." "And when your past threatened that," Price replied, "you chose violence." Her voice broke. "He said silence had become complicity." Price nodded. "He was right." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I only wanted him to stop." "You did." She rose slowly. "I suppose that is all that matters now." Price shook his head gently. "No, what matters is that his name will be cleared." She swallowed. "He was a good man." "Yes," Price said. The constable entered. Margaret smoothed her skirt and stood without protest. As she passed Price, she paused. "He protected me once," she whispered. Price did not reply. She was escorted away. Price stepped outside into the cooling evening. The tower loomed above, silent now. Soon the bells would ring again, marking not celebration, but consequence. Price knew the village would mend in time, but it would never quite forget. Some truths leave echoes, and in Briarcombe, those echoes had finally reached the bells. Inspector Price stood near the lich gate and watched as villagers made their way into St. Bartholomew's Church. Faces were subdued. Conversations were brief. And news had spread quickly, but acceptance moved more slowly. Margaret Blythe had been taken to the county jail. Thomas Reed sat under guard in the vestry, and Reverend Arthur Whitcombe lay in a simple coffin before the altar he had served for more than 20 years. Price did not enter the church. He had learned long ago that closure belonged to those who remained. Instead, he waited until Clara Whitcombe approached him along the gravel path, a leather folio held tightly against her chest. "They have finished arranging things," she said quietly. "Yes." She followed his gaze toward the tower. "He meant to speak the truth," she said, "even knowing what it might cost." Price inclined his head. "Some men choose comfort," he said. "Others choose clarity." She nodded. "I've been reading his papers, letters from parishioners, notes from families he helped. He was not weak." "No," Price agreed, he was not." She drew a slow breath. "I intend to stay for a while. The accounts will be reviewed properly. The record corrected." Price studied her. "Briarcombe will resist," he said gently. "Villages prefer familiar stories." Clara lifted her chin. "Then they will learn a better one." Price found himself approving. Mr. Henshaw emerged briefly from the church doorway. "Inspector," he called softly, "would you care to say a few words?" Price shook his head. "My work here is finished." The curate nodded and returned inside. Later, in the rectory parlour, Price gathered those who remained. Edward Hale, stiff and silent, Mrs. Dallow, pale and shaken, and 2 members of the parish council. He did not dramatise. He laid out the facts. 12 years earlier, parish funds had been taken for medical care. Margaret Blythe had altered the books, intending to repay quietly. Reverend Whitcombe discovered the discrepancy and chose to absorb the blame. Edward Hale lowered his eyes. "In recent weeks," Price continued, "the Reverend reconsidered his silence. He believed the village could not build its future on a lie." Mrs. Dallow wept openly. "On Saturday night, he confronted Miss Blythe in the bell tower. During the argument, she struck him with a wrench. Thomas Reed assisted afterward, forging the confession and silencing the bells." Silence followed. Not disbelief, acceptance. Edward Hale cleared his throat. "His name?" "Will be cleared," Price said. "Fully?" Hale nodded once. As dusk settled, Price stepped outside. The tower rose against the darkening sky, no longer ominous, only stone and shadow. He paused at the gate and looked back. Villages mistook familiarity for virtue. They confused protection with righteousness, but secrets did not fade with time. They hardened, and when finally broken, they left fractures no one expected. Inspector Price adjusted his coat collar. Behind him the bells rang once more, a single clear toll, not for ceremony, not for deception, for remembrance. Price walked down the lane without turning. Briarcombe would mend, as villages always did. Memory would soften. Children would play beneath the same tower that had once concealed a crime. And Reverend Arthur Whitcombe's name, restored at last, would endure not as a confession pinned to his robe, but as a man who chose truth, even when it came too late. Mist gathered again along the hedgerows. By morning, Briarcombe would look unchanged, but Inspector Price knew better. Some truths linger, and some bells once rung are never truly silent again.